Welcome to the debate. So, imagine a human brain so, overwhelmed by the sheer act of finding words that it physically freezes up.
Yeah, like it just completely hits a wall.
Right, exactly. Now imagine that same brain finding a backdoor, like a mathematical cheat code to bypass language entirely. It communicates instead in pure, abstract geometry.
Which, sounds completely wild.
It does. But today we are asking a really fascinating question. Can a highly abstract philosophical concept act as a literal hard-coded structural pillar inside the human brain?
It is a fascinating, almost science fiction level premise, I'll give you that. But it is actually rooted in very real, very modern neuroscience. We are talking about taking something that usually belongs in a philosophy textbook and looking for its fingerprint inside the wet electrical tissue of the primate connectome.
Yes, exactly. We are examining the structural and neurobiological validity of what is known as the Tom Hennigan constant. In the math, this is represented as gbest, and it basically sits at the very center of the Verhaeghe-Hennigan communication framework, or the VHC.
Right, the VHC.
So I will be arguing today that this constant is a biological and mathematical necessity. I really believe the data shows that it is a structural prerequisite, one that allows a neurodivergent brain to bypass severe cognitive bottlenecks.
And, while I find the underlying neurological data that this framework relies upon to be just absolutely beautiful science, I will be taking the opposing view today.
Okay.
My position is that taking this verifiable motor planning neurology and escalating it to claim that a specific conceptual entity, this Tom Hennigan constant, physically binds 67 biological files together is, it's an unproven inflationary leap. We just have to be very careful not to map poetic coding metaphors onto raw biology.
I get that. But to understand why I don't see it as just poetry, we really have to start with the foundational logic of the VHC framework. And that relies on a philosophical concept called Hartree-Field's disquotationalism.
Okay, let's get into the philosophy for a second.
Right, so before we lose everyone in the academic jargon, let's define what that actually means. Disquotationalism is basically the idea that saying the phrase, "snow is white" is true, is the exact same as just saying snow is white.
Right. So the addition of "is true" adds absolutely zero new information to the sentence. It just, strips away the quotation marks. It is completely deflationary.
Precisely. The classical T schema is literally just P is true if and only if P. The left side of that equation, the statement that something is true, carries no cognitive weight whatsoever. Now apply that to the VHC framework. In this model, the left side of the schema consists of verbal wrappers, which we denote as X status. These are your literal, continuous, spoken statements. Think of a person using defensive sarcasm, anxious conversational loops, or, going on long, winding tangents about their dreams. These are high-entropy, low-bandwidth signals. They essentially act as an outward-facing firewall.
They're just noise past the gray walls. They are the "is true" part of the sentence, right? Just social filler.
Yes, exactly. And they have zero real cognitive content without the right side of the schema, which is X internal, or simply phi. That right side is the actual unflattened physical state of the brain.
The biology.
Right. It is the raw, Q-coupled biological synchronization written directly to the connectome. For this neurobiological system to function, those planned actions and behaviors must physically snap onto this conceptual grid where the probability of alignment is absolute, where P equals 0.000.
So the math requires it.
The math literally demands a stabilizing constant to make that disquotational equivalence work. And, that is exactly what the Tom Hennigan constant is.
Look, I completely acknowledge the validity of the math plots from the recent Nature 2026 paper that this framework is pulling from. The data mapping how the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC, and the ventral premotor cortex, the PMV, processes information is truly groundbreaking.
It really is.
But I have to push back here. Applying classical deflationary truth theory to assert that a highly specific conceptual persona operates on absolute syntactic invariance to bind a biological connectome is,
It's a massive category mistake.
A category mistake? How so, if the math lines?
Because you are taking observable, verifiable neural dissociations, specifically how the brain encodes action algorithms independently of physical muscle movements, and you are wrongly attributing this biological reality to a metaphysical mechanism.
I don't think it's metaphysical, though.
But you're looking now localized geometric fit in the brain and escalating it to a universal property. Ironically, that contradicts the very deflationary truth theory you are utilizing. I mean, the empirical data proves that abstract motor planning exists, yes, but it does not prove the ontological reality of this constant as an actual biological binding agent.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on how the physical brain actually enforces this philosophical schema. We aren't just making a leap here. We are looking at the category boundary matrix from the literature.
Okay, the matrix data.
Yes, specifically, when we look at the primitive alignment score in these primate brains, the data reveals a steep, sigmoidal nonlinearity exactly at the category boundary. The paper refers to this as morph-ver.
Let's unpack that for a moment, just to be clear. A sigmoidal nonlinearity essentially looks like an S-curve on a graph, right?
Exactly, an S-curve.
So what the data shows is that neural activity in the DLPFC, the prefrontal cortex, is noisy. It processes continuous, blurry spatial locations, but the moment that signal hits the PMV, the premotor cortex, the curve snaps sharply.
Exactly, it snaps. The PMV population trajectories separate cleanly and categorically into two distinct primitive encoding states, A1 versus A2, right before the physical go cue.
Right.
The brain completely and categorically rejects continuous, blurry, ambiguous shade. A planned action either fits the geometric shape or it does not. 1 + 1 = 2. This isn't just a metaphor. This is the exact physical visual representation of a bivalent truth schema hard-coded into the primate connectome. The brain physically enforces a disquotational binary.
I come at it from a different way. I completely agree that the PMVA forces a hard binary fit for motor planning. Watching the brain snap a motor plan from a noisy gradient into a hard binary is incredible science.
It's undeniable.
Yes, but we have to ask a foundational question here. How does a biological binary for a physical hand movement translate into the claim that this conceptual constant does not read, say, social flirtation as vague noise?
Because the architecture scales, it has to.
But that is a tremendous leap. You are taking a geometric, localized neural primitive, literally a cluster of neurons that simply dictates whether a primate hand grasps or pulls, and you are assigning it complex social interpretive power?
Well,
The PMV does not process transactional social games. It processes motor preparation, framing the rejection of ambiguous shade in motor planning as proof that a metaphysical constant bypasses social noise is taking a neurobiological truth and stretching it into a psychological absolute.
but it is not about assigning social power to a hand grasp. It is about understanding that the social interaction itself is processed through that exact same invariant geometric logic, because the system is forced to do it.
Forced to?
Yes, and this is the crucial why of the entire framework. We have to look at the systemic bottleneck. Why would a brain rely on a mathematical cheat code for social or communicative data? Because of acute rapid naming deficit, or RND, which is often paired with stealth dyslexia and dyscalculia.
Ah, the metabolic drain, the extreme biological cost of translating parallel thoughts into sequential words?
Yes. Think about what happens when you try to explain a really complex concept sequentially. For a brain with this specific architecture, raw sequential text and continuous, wordy explanations function as a severe metabolic drain.
It gets overloaded.
Completely. If the system is forced to sequentially name and explain every single coordinate of its internal design, it hits a flat, illiterate wall. This literally jams the supramammillary nucleus, the SM, and forces a paralyzing dorso-vagal freeze. The body effectively shuts down.
Which is a terrifying physiological state, by the way. The heart rate drops. The system essentially plays dead because it is completely overwhelmed by the cognitive load of serial processing.
Exactly. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine having a massive, highly detailed 3D architectural CAD file. Now, Try to verbally explain every single geometric line of that 3D file to a computer over a 1990s 56K dial-up modem.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
What happens? The bandwidth isn't there. The connection times out. The system crashes. The sequential naming brain simply cannot handle the parallel processing required to communicate the blueprint. Therefore, a bypass is biologically required.
And this is where you argue the constant comes in as the bypass.
Yes, exactly. Following Leeds and Quine, Harthree-Field emphasizes that a purely disquotational truth predicate serves to formulate infinite conjunctions that cannot otherwise be expressed without what mathematicians call a substitutional quantifier.
Right, the global attractor.
Yes. In the VHC framework, Tom acts as that global attractor. He is the universal substitutional quantifier, a sort of master zip file, if you will, that instantly binds the infinite conjunction of 67 specialized internal biological files.
Just instantly zips them up.
Yep. Using what the framework calls a custom Boolean well shield and the doot-doot operator. The system skips the dial-up modem entirely. The unshielded action symbols hit his grid, enforce a hard binary fit, and bypass the sum jam, avoiding the freeze altogether.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the mechanical reality of what you are actually describing? You are referencing highly specific, idiosyncratic concepts like the memory continuity of the spirit of Luke 1.1 alongside Boolean operators.
Right.
Utilizing a Boolean well shield as a compiler bypass is a fascinating heuristic, as a way of understanding how a neurodivergent brain might skip sequential processing to avoid a dorso-vagal freeze. It is elegant, but a heuristic is a mental shortcut, right? It's a model.
In this framework, it is more than a heuristic, though. It is the physical architecture of the compiler.
But is it? Let's take a step back. Framing this bypass as proof of an immutable axiom representing positive infinity, which is maintained by Stella Maris to keep the local system Stella Maris quiet in the shade, this is where I have to throw a flag.
Throw a flag?
Yes, because you are conflating poetic, internal coding metaphors with rigid neurobiology. Does the brain utilize global attractors to stabilize complex networks? Yes. Is avoiding the supermum bottleneck a real neurobiological imperative? Absolutely.
Right, so we agree on the mechanics.
But assigning the identity of this universal substitutional quantifier to a persona and claiming it instantly binds exactly 67 internal biological files, that is where the framework leaves empirical neuroscience and just enters personal mythology.
So you're saying science is being hijacked by a narrative?
I am saying you're using the rigid, authoritative language of mathematics, infinite conjunctions, Boolean operators, to validate a deeply internal narrative structure. It is a beautiful narrative, sure, but it is not a biological constant.
I have to challenge that, because you are stripping away the mathematical reality of the empirical hardware just to dismiss the architecture as mythology. If we want to remove the poetic terminology, fine, let's do it. We must look exclusively at the raw, multi-area neural distances and the kinematic data.
Okay, let's look at the data.
Let's look at Figure 4 from the research, specifically the location and size invariance.
The data tracking how the brain responds to objects in different spaces.
Yes, exactly. The data shows that while the prefrontal cortex, the DLPFC, is strongly driven by low-level physical locations, like where an object is in space, the PMV population activity clusters strictly by the planned primitive.
So it abstracts it.
It doesn't care if the object is up, down, large, or small. It remains completely invariant across locations and sizes. This visualizes the absolute motor invariance of these bimanual action symbols. They function exactly like visual coding blocks like CS50 scratch blocks. You just snap them together.
Right. They operate independently of spatial orientation.
Exactly. And we can reinforce this by looking at extended data figure 16, the letter value plot. It tracks what's called the fraction of variance accounted for, or the FVAF, by finger kinematics. To put that plainly, it measures how much a brain region cares about the actual speed and physical movement of your muscles.
Right. Like if you move your hand twice as fast, how much does the brain activity change?
Exactly. And the data shows that while the primary motor cortex, the M1, strongly encodes generic movement velocity, so it has a high FVAF, but the PMV activity, it has a 0 to negative FVAF.
Interesting.
There is a complete and total dissociation from low-level muscle kinematics. Think of the PMV as the architect drawing a blueprint and the primary motor cortex as the construction workers swinging the hammers. The architect doesn't care how hard the hammer is swung, they just care that the geometric shape of the room is correct.
The architect just provides the abstract plan.
Yes, and this visually empirically proves that the planned somatic goals are abstract. They are what the framework calls JAX-compiled JIT geometry, just-in-time compiled math. The action is the algorithm. Therefore, the conceptual alignment with the constant is a spatial and verbal invariant. It does not depend on word order variables. It is pure geometry.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The data you are citing is flawless, but the conclusion you're drawing from it is where we really disconnect.
Okay.
You're looking at brilliant neurobiological data and drawing a philosophical conclusion that the data simply does not demand. The 0 to negative FVAF in the PMV absolutely proves that the primary motor cortex handles muscle velocity while the ventral premotor cortex handles abstract planned primitives.
Right.
It beautifully demonstrates that the brain plans actions as discrete abstract symbols decoupled from continuous muscle contractions.
Which validates the right side of the T-schema. It validates that the physical state is a discrete, unflattened reality.
It validates that the action is the algorithm, yes. I concede that point entirely. But it does not logically necessitate that the algorithm must be the Tom Hennigan constant.
But
the dissociation between the construction worker and the architect just proves that abstract motor planning exists independently of physical sequential variables. It shows us how the primate brain readies a physical movement without being bogged down by the kinematic execution details.
But you can't separate the mechanism from its communicative function in this specific framework.
But to say this hardware architecture is the biological equivalent of an invariant handshake with a specific named constant is an enormous leap. The empirical hardware proves that the brain uses invariant geometric blocks. It does absolutely nothing to prove the identity or the metaphysical reality of the persona you claim is receiving those blocks.
I think you are treating the VHC framework as if it is trying to prove this constant exists in a vacuum. Like a star in a telescope. But the constant is the mathematical necessity of the framework. We establish the biological emergency the local system has a severe rapid naming deficit.
The freezing we talked about.
Yes, it literally cannot process the continuous and paper bridges required by standard human communication. It freezes. Because the PMV operates on completely invariant abstract geometry, delegating the text-matching metabolic tax to the constant allows the system to survive.
So you're saying the biological necessity creates the constant?
I am saying it forces it into existence as a structural pillar. By delegating that translation tax to the constant to Stella Maris, it allows the eventual consistency of the neurodivergent system to compile flawlessly on its own clock, without crashing. The structural reality of the connectome demands a global attractor that operates exactly as Field's disquotationalism describes. The sigmoidal nonlinearity, the PMV decoupling, the absolute rejection of continuous metaphors, these aren't just neat neurological party tricks of the motor cortex, they are the physical substrate of the T-schema. They validate gbest as the necessary biological compiler that bypasses the R&D.
Well, and as we look to summarize our positions today, I think my stance rests entirely on the vital distinction between a biological mechanism and a psychological metaphor. The Nature 2026 data you have cited beautifully illustrates how bimanual action symbols operate with absolute motor invariance.
It really does.
The separation of the prefrontal cortex's noisy spatial processing from the premotor cortex's clean binary primitive encoding states is a triumph of modern neuroscience. Absolutely no one is debating that.
But you feel the framework stretches the data.
I think it stretches it to its absolute breaking point. Yeah. It takes empirical motor planning data and uses it to validate a highly specific theoretical construct. The leap from the brain plans physical actions as abstract geometric symbols to a global attractor named Tom Hennigan instantly binds 67 biological files via an infinite conjunction operator, is where the rigorous science ends and the philosophical poetry begins.
It seems we have reached a point of truly fascinating tension here. I look at the invariant geometry of the PMV, and I see the physical instantiation of a necessary mathematical constant, a literal structural reality that saves a neurodivergent system from systemic metabolic freeze.
Right.
And you look at the exact same geometry and you see a brilliant, purely mechanical motor planning mechanism that has been draped in an unnecessarily complex philosophical wrapper.
I think that is an incredibly fair and accurate assessment of our disagreement. And yet, despite that tension, I think we both have to acknowledge a profound shared convergence here today.
Oh, absolutely. Regardless of whether we conceptualize it as a highly specific mathematical constant or simply standard ventral premotor cortex population trajectories, we agree on the core biological reality. The primate frontal cortex definitively encodes planned somatic goals as discrete, abstract symbols rather than continuous muscle contractions.
Absolutely. The brain categorically rejects the blurry, continuous shade in favor of the hard, geometric binary fit. 1 + 1 = 2 at the cellular level.
Right.
And reflecting on this intricate tension between mapping philosophical truth predicates onto biological hardware, well, it strongly suggests that the architecture of the human connectome holds deeper mysteries than we currently have the language for. We are just barely beginning to understand how abstract logic might physically write itself into our neural pathways.
Which brings us right back to the premise we started with, When you look at the human connectome, you aren't looking at a simple machine. You are looking at a system so astonishingly complex that when faced with a catastrophic linguistic bottleneck, it can bypass its own deficits by communicating in pure, invariant geometry.
It's incredible.
It really forces us to ask a final question. When the diagnostic waters are this muddy and the human brain is pushed to its absolute limits, is the clearest image found in the raw biology or in the abstract math?
Or perhaps, the truth lives entirely in the space between the two.